There's a kind of quiet magic that lingers in old places, a kind of hush, like the walls themselves are keeping secrets. And in one small town, tucked away between a crooked alley and a cobblestone street, stood a library where time seemed to move a little slower. Its windows were tall and foggy in the mornings, letting in slanted beams of light that made the dust dance in the air like tiny specks of gold. The shelves were lined with books that smelled of paper, ink, and history. Each book held its own story, and every corner whispered a memory to anyone who cared to listen. It was in this place, a library forgotten by many but cherished by a few, that our story begins. And it begins with a girl named Lina Carter. Lina was 24 years old, with kind eyes the color of hazelnut, and hair that tumbled down in soft waves the shade of dark coffee. She wasn't loud or particularly bold. She didn't command attention when she entered a room, nor did she seek it. No, Lina was the kind of girl who quietly carried entire worlds inside her heart, built from the pages of the books she read. While others chased after big adventures and grand gestures, Lina found joy in the soft, simple things. The rustle of paper when turning a page, the scent of rain against old stone walls, the warmth of a cup of tea held between her palms. And of all the places in the world, the library was her refuge. She would often joke to herself that she'd fallen in love with fictional characters more times than she cared to admit. Heroes from centuries past, and mysterious poets who spoke in tender verses. It was safer that way, she thought. Books couldn't break your heart, but even Lina, with her cautious soul, secretly dreamed of a love like the ones in her stories, the kind that starts quietly, then takes you by surprise. And one rainy afternoon, that's exactly what happened. The rain was soft that day, a steady patter against the windows, as if the sky itself was sighing. Lina sat curled in her favorite corner of the library, a worn leather chair tucked beneath a tall window framed by deep green curtains. In her hands she held a well-loved copy of Pride and Prejudice, its pages yellowed with age, the cover frayed at the edges. She had read it countless times before, but somehow it always felt like coming home. As she turned to chapter 16, something unusual happened. A small piece of folded paper slipped out from between the pages, fluttering to the floor like a leaf on a breeze. Lina blinked, frowning slightly. She reached down and picked it up, curiosity stirring in her chest. The paper was plain, no markings on the outside. She unfolded it carefully, and there, in neat, slightly slanted handwriting, were the words, "To the girl who loves love stories, your smile brightens this dusty room more than the sun ever could." For a moment, Lina sat perfectly still. Her heart gave a tiny, startled jump, the kind that feels like it skips a beat before racing ahead. She looked up, scanning the room, but the library was nearly empty. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly librarian, sat at the front desk, humming to herself as she sorted through a stack of returned books. A man she'd seen before, always scribbling in a notebook, sat by the window, his head bent over his work. No one seemed to be watching her. No one appeared mischievous or out of place. Lina glanced down at the note again. A warmth crept into her cheeks. Was it a prank? An accident? A message meant for someone else? Or could it have been meant for her? She tucked the note carefully into the book and smiled to herself. Whatever it was, it had made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, Lina tried to brush it off, but every time she opened a book, a tiny part of her hoped to find another note, a sign, a message, anything. And then it happened again. This time in a copy of Jane Eyre, another folded piece of paper hidden halfway through the book, and the words were simple, but they made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. I wonder if you believe in the kind of love that finds you when you least expect it. Lina's fingers trembled as she held the note. Someone Someone out there was leaving these for her. But who? And why? The library wasn't exactly bustling with crowds. Most days, only a handful of regulars came by, students buried in textbooks, retirees seeking peace, and the quiet man at the window with his ever-present notebook. The mystery tugged at her curiosity, wrapping around her thoughts like ivy. And though she told herself it didn't matter, her eyes began to wander as she walked through the aisles, scanning faces, looking for a glance that lingered too long, for a hint of a smile. But the notes kept appearing. In Little Women, Wuthering Heights, The Great Gatsby, each one more tender than the last. Each one spoke as if the writer knew her heart. And Lina, the girl who had hidden behind the safety of pages her whole life, felt herself falling for someone she'd never even met. Now, if you've ever found yourself wondering whether it's possible to fall for someone through words alone, Lina was proof that you could. Because, with every note she discovered, it was as if a hand reached out from the paper and gently touched her heart. The words weren't grand or overly poetic. They were simple, honest, as though whoever was writing them understood her loneliness without needing to ask about it. Like they knew how it felt to sit in a room full of people, yet feel as though you didn't quite belong to any of them. And so, with each passing day, the library became more than just her favorite refuge. It became a treasure map of quiet clues, leading her to a stranger she hadn't yet seen, but whose words were beginning to feel more familiar than her own thoughts.
Of all the people who frequented the library, there was one person who quietly caught Lina's attention more than the others. A man, perhaps a few years older than her, who always occupied the same seat by the window. He had dark, wavy hair that often fell into his eyes, which were the kind of deep, stormy blue you'd only notice if you were close enough. He spent hours scribbling into a worn leather notebook, occasionally glancing out the window, as if searching for something the world refused to show him. They had never spoken, but there was a kind of quiet understanding between them, the sort that happens between two people who share the same spaces for long enough. Strangers, yet not quite invisible to one another. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and a small, polite smile would be exchanged before both returned to their respective worlds. And though Lina told herself she was being ridiculous, a tiny voice in the back of her mind began to wonder, could it be him? Could the man with the thoughtful eyes and ink-stained hands be the one leaving her those notes? It seemed impossible. And yet, wasn't that exactly how the best stories began?
The library itself was a character in this story, filled with creaking floorboards, the scent of old paper, and the occasional draft that made the lamps flicker. And at the heart of it all was Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly librarian. A woman with silver hair always tied into a loose bun, eyes that twinkled behind wire-framed glasses, and a voice as soft as velvet. Mrs. Whitmore had been watching over the library longer than most people in town had been alive. She noticed things. The way Lina lingered by the poetry section a little longer these days. The way her gaze followed the man by the window, and the way her hands trembled slightly whenever she unfolded another note. One afternoon, unable to resist any longer, Lina approached the front desk where Mrs. Whitmore was busy sorting returned books. She hesitated, then cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I was wondering if you've seen anyone leaving notes in the books." The librarian peered up at her, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, leaning in as though sharing a precious secret. "This old place has seen more love stories than you might imagine. Sometimes hearts speak in ways words spoken aloud never could." Lina's brows furrowed. "So, you have noticed?" The librarian chuckled softly, reaching out to pat Lina's hand. "I've noticed everything," she said warmly. "And if I may offer a bit of advice, don't run from it. Let the story unfold. Follow where it leads." There was something in her voice that made Lina's chest tighten. Hope, maybe, or something even braver. That evening, Lina sat at a corner table, the notes she'd collected spread out before her like fragments of a puzzle. She read them again and again, tracing each letter as though she could absorb the person behind them through ink and paper alone. And that's when she noticed something. Each note had been left in books from the classic literature section. Not in modern romances, not in fantasy novels, but always among the timeless love stories. Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Little Women, The Great Gatsby. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Her pulse quickened. She glanced up at the man by the window, still scribbling in his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. Could it really be him? Part of her wanted to march over and ask, to demand answers, to put an end to the restless ache in her heart. But another part, the part that loved the mystery, the unfolding of a story line by line, urged her to wait, to let it happen the way it was meant to. After all, hadn't she always believed the best love stories were the ones that unfolded slowly in quiet, stolen moments? So Lina made a decision. She would follow the trail. She would let the story reveal itself. And whatever waited at the end, whether heartbreak or hope, she would face it. Because for the first time in a long time, she felt truly, undeniably alive. In the days that followed, Lina found herself visiting the library more often than ever before. It wasn't intentional, or so she told herself. She wasn't chasing after anyone. She wasn't hoping to find another note. At least, that's what she would have said aloud. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something had shifted inside her. A dormant part of her heart, the part that had long ago decided it was safer to live inside stories than risk her own, had been gently stirred awake. Every time she entered the library now, it felt different, as if the air itself was charged with possibility. The books weren't just books anymore. They were vessels carrying secret messages. Each spine she touched, each page she turned, might reveal another fragment of a heart quietly reaching out to hers. And though the notes remained anonymous, she began to notice little details she hadn't before. A faint scent of ink lingering between the pages. The way the handwriting was always the same, neat, slightly slanted to the right, like someone who wrote with purpose but not haste. She started lingering by the classic literature section, her fingers brushing against the titles she'd already searched before, just in case a new note had appeared. Sometimes she found nothing. Other times, her heart would leap as a small folded paper slipped free from the pages. And with each new note, she fell a little deeper into the quiet spell being woven around her. One note simply read, "I wonder if you know how beautiful you look when you're lost in a book. The world fades away, and it's like you become part of the story itself." Another said, "I don't know your name, but I know the way your eyes light up when you find a passage you love, and I wish I were brave enough to tell you this face to face." They weren't declarations of love, not yet, but there was tenderness in those words, an honesty so rare in a world that too often rushed past the small, quiet things. And it wasn't long before Lina found herself lying awake at night, wondering about the writer. Who was this person who seemed to understand her in ways even her closest friends never had? Had they been watching her for weeks, months? Were they shy, like her, afraid to reach out directly, but unable to stay silent any longer? The questions clung to her like soft, invisible threads, and though she told herself it was foolish to daydream about a stranger, she couldn't help it. Because sometimes the heart knows things long before the mind catches up. It was on one quiet evening, just before closing time, that fate decided to nudge the story forward. The library was nearly empty. The rain tapped gently against the window panes, a soft lullaby for the weary and the restless. Lina stood by the poetry section, her fingers trailing along the spines of old, leather-bound books. She felt a presence nearby and glanced up to see the man from the window seat, the one who always scribbled in his notebook, standing a few feet away. He was browsing through a collection of poems, his brow furrowed in thought. And though they'd exchanged small smiles before, this was the first time they stood so close, unshielded by distance or the safety of unspoken routine. Without thinking, Lina spoke. "Do you have a favorite?" she asked softly, nodding toward the shelves. The man looked up, surprised, then offered a small, crooked smile. "It depends on the day," he replied, his voice warm and slightly rough, like someone who didn't use it often but carried kindness in his words. "I guess today it's this one," he added, holding up a thin volume of poetry by Pablo Neruda. Lina smiled, feeling a strange, nervous warmth bloom in her chest. "I've always loved Neruda," she admitted. "His words feel like secrets." The man's eyes softened. "Yeah," he murmured, "secrets you wish someone would whisper to you." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The rain, the creaking shelves, the distant hum of Mrs. Whitmore's radio at the front desk, all of it faded into a gentle hush. And in that hush, something unspoken passed between them. A spark, a thread, a silent agreement that neither of them quite understood yet. "I'm Ethan," he said finally, extending a hand. "Lina," she replied, slipping her hand into his. His touch was warm, steady, and though it was the briefest of gestures, it felt like something inside her had quietly shifted.